Okay, maybe we'll just give it another 30 seconds or so. I know there's a big group expected today, so let's just give a few extra seconds for people to log in. All right, well, let's get started. We are going to be recording the session. I know that question was just asked in the chat. We'll also be providing a copy of these slides as well for anyone who is interested. Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Cortland. I am a senior solutions engineer with Questica, which is a UNA Solutions brand. And today we're going to be discussing using enrollment to predict tuition revenue. Before beginning, just like to quickly thank NACUBO for allowing us this opportunity to speak today on what we hope is a very relevant and interesting topic. And then just in terms of the timeline, we are prepared to give everyone a couple of minutes back. I know this has been scheduled for an hour, but we should have some time at the end for open discussion and questions and answers as well. But feel free to type any questions you might have in the Q&A feature, and then we can get to those when we get to that session, probably around the 45-minute mark. So with that out of the way, let's jump into our agenda slide and start talking about why we're here. So we'll be discussing high level why we're here in the first place. We'll be discussing some of the specific challenges that come along with being able to accurately predict enrollment and the revenues that you can expect from those enrollment numbers. And then primarily, we're going to be discussing different models or techniques and approaches that you can use as an institution when you're trying to solve this problem, which is incredibly relevant. How many students can we expect into the future? And what are the different types of revenues that are the lifeblood of the organization that are going to allow us to continue on as a school? So models offer a very systematic approach to being able to predict enrollment and tuition, and we're going to be talking about some of the various options that can apply to your institution. All of these different models have different pros and cons, but we're going to be discussing kind of the basic options that are out there in terms of the model approach. And then regardless of which model or approach you choose to implement as an institution, there's always that difference between theory and practice. And we need to give you some best practices in order to bridge those gaps so that you'll be ultimately more successful as an institution in being able to accurately predict both enrollment and tuition. Or I should say all revenues, not just tuition, but tuition tends to be the biggest driver of revenue at any institution. We'll also be talking about some future technology considerations, next steps, or what could be next on the horizon in this particular subject. And as I mentioned, we'll leave some time at the end for open discussion and to deal with any questions that might be asked throughout the session today. So with that preamble out of the way, let's jump directly in to why we're here. We'd like to have a number of key takeaways from today's session. First and foremost, let's talk about the subject itself, some of the history, concepts, and strategies that institutions have used over the years and continue to use in modern day that look at both the prediction of enrollment and the forecasting of all the revenues related to those student numbers. We'll introduce you to these different models and concepts and strategies. Today's session is meant to be very introductory. We're not going to be doing a deep dive into any of these particular models, but it should give you a good foundation if you want to go start exploring more on these subjects yourselves. And we will also be providing some links within the slide deck, as well as a white paper or two as well as an addendum to this session. Those should already be available in the chat, I believe. But if they're not, please let our team know here. We'll also look at helping you apply these concepts at your own institutions as well, because there is always that gap between theory and practice. So hopefully you can get some key takeaways on things to avoid and also things to really stress if you're looking to start implementing a more robust approach to prediction of both enrollment and forecasting of revenues. And then hopefully this gives you some ideas as an institution in general, because one of the big takeaways is that when you do become more robust in your ability to predict the future, it's also going to make your institution more flexible and able to adapt to these things, which can change very rapidly over time. So getting a clearer picture of the future is going to help you be more prepared overall as an institution, and it also hopefully will inform high-level decision making at the school as well. Okay, so let's start with the history of higher education. The actual term university was coined back in 1088. This is the University of Bologna in Italy, which still exists today. And in the 900 plus years that have taken place since that was originally built as a school, we've had a long history of higher education across the world. We see different flavors and different types of higher education institutions that come in different forms. These can be publicly funded, these can be completely private, these can also be a hybrid between the two. But we see lots of different types of colleges and universities and different forms of higher education across the world. But one thing is consistent among all these different types is they need some sort of funding to be viable as institutions. And these key differences in funding offer unique advantages and disadvantages. For example, if you have a lot of public funding as an institution, that can be very predictable and stable, but governments aren't immune to economic pressures. When times are bad, funding could be cut, and that could affect the institution's ability to sustain the enrollment and the levels of education that they currently enjoy. Whereas if you're a private institution, you'd be maybe more insulated from government cutbacks, but you could also be more privy to things like competition or other economic factors, which can equally affect both the public and private sectors. So regardless of what the funding situation is at the school, there's always going to be unique financial challenges that apply to any organization or institution of higher learning. And there will be years that are leaner and require more flexibility in terms of the finance approach. So being able to accurately plan for these situations is going to be critical to the long-term financial health of the organization. And one thing these recent years have really shown is that the financial world within higher education is extremely dynamic. Things like global pandemics, for example, can have long-term effects on both enrollment rates and student behaviors and even public perception of institutions like colleges and universities. So the hardships is, of course, you can't always predict these things. And the future is unknowable to a certain extent, but there are ways to make estimated guesses, which is really the entire purpose of today's session. So when we start looking at enrollment forecasting first specifically, there's a lot of different factors that can make enrollment forecasting particularly difficult, regardless of the size or the scale of your institution. There are always going to be different types of students enrolled at each school, and each type of student are going to have their own unique behaviors and differences as both individuals within a group and as part of a group themselves. But things like full versus part-time students, international versus domestic, in-state versus out-of-state, all of these different student types can have their own unique factors, which makes prediction difficult. How do we know how many international students to predict when we might cut off international students from coming into the country in the first place, for example? But we can also have different rates of attrition and different application and acceptance rates. If you're running a very sought after program within a school with limited enrollment, then you would expect very high application rates and very low acceptance rates. The reverse may be true for the opposite situation, where it's a very generic course and there's a lot of capacity. The demand may not be there on the application side, which means you have the opposite problem. But basically, looking at all of these different types of students and trying to predict how many are going to be there in a given semester or year is always going to be difficult. So the easiest place to start is usually by looking at the historical trends that might happen at a school, which is great, except sometimes these historical trends tell an incomplete or misleading picture. So You need to factor in not just the historical trends, but also additional considerations which may be unique to your particular school. For example, is there new grant funding or revenue sources that are applying to the school this year? Are there other institutional factors which may affect things like the demand for applying to your school in the first place? This can be incredibly difficult and incredibly context dependent. So being able to latch on all of these additional considerations along with all of the other dimensions that make this forecasting exercise difficult in the first place is going to be really critical in order to getting a clear and effective enrollment forecasting method. And then for the other side of this discussion, what makes revenue forecasting difficult? Well, that also involves all this multi-dimensional variability that's going to apply from one school to another, but also one department or program within a school to another. If I enroll in a science program, maybe I have a lab fee and lab hours that need to be accounted for. Whereas if I'm applying to a music program, maybe there's some kind of instrumental cost associated with my degree. These things can greatly affect tuition rates, as well as the various fees and administrative costs associated with all of your different students. What one institution looks like is going to vary wildly. And over time, tuition rates are also themselves going to be variables which go up and down over time. Generally speaking, they've been going up in years past, but this is also going to be institutionally dependent. And a model is going to need to account for all of these different dimensions, which can greatly affect the revenue that you can collect from a particular type of student that's enrolled in your institution. So, the more complex the different combinations of student types and fees are, the more difficult revenue forecasting is going to be, because you need a model that's going to account for all of those edge cases, which can make the overall revenue picture incredibly difficult, especially when students may be able to opt in or out of specific fees. Then you also have some kind of fudge factor that you need to account for within each of these models, because there's some unpredictability, even if you know everything about the student that's going to be applying to your school, which is going to make this exercise even more difficult in the first place. So when we start talking about using models to project, to forecast, to know the future, this is certainly nothing new, and this is nothing restricted to the financial world. If you want to look at our example on the right-hand side, this is a spreadsheet that's looking at predicting statistical information from Major League Baseball players. So for anyone who's seen the movie Moneyball, the entire idea behind the movie was that a disadvantaged Oakland Athletic team was being outspent in terms of payroll and spending on players. So they had to be a lot more careful with the way they spent money, which meant looking at the underlying statistical data that led them to more efficient players per money spent than their competitors, which is very powerful. And it showed that in their case, they could have a very, very small, relatively sized payroll, but be extremely competitive in terms of outcomes and in terms of being able to predict future behavior of the players. So models can be extremely powerful and give you that insight into what's going to happen in the future, even with the incomplete information we have to work with. And the nice thing about powerful models is that they can also offer insight into why underlying behavior may be happening at, for example, the school. If you have a program where enrollment's been going down each and every year, that can start to also maybe explain why that might be the case. Maybe it's a very unpopular program when compared to some of the other options in the landscape. Maybe the teacher involved is just very unpopular. There could be a lot of different reasons, but a good model is going to be able to highlight that these trends are in fact happening and allow the institution to start going and seeing some of those underlying factors which are leading to these behaviors. Also essential to the long-term success of any model is the ability for it to be tested against itself and against reality. It's one thing to be able to say, I predict, my baseball players are going to hit this for their average next year. But when next year happens, you can compare what the model predicted in terms of batting average and home runs and anything else to what actually happened on the field. Similarly, If you're expecting X amount of students in a particular program, well, next year when that program is actually running, you can compare what the model is suggesting will happen versus what actually happened in terms of student counts. And then you can determine how robust the model is at offering its predictive power. So ideally, institution does not have to be married to one particular approach, because the real strength is the ability to go after several approaches and then test them against themselves for predictive accuracy. So if you do have an approach to project enrollment, that's great. Why don't you actually match that up with the actual enrollment that takes place and then see what was ultimately the most effective? Rather than going with one model, why not go for 2 or 3 and see which one does the best job of predicting the future? And then looking at enrollment forecasting models, this is really the bigger challenge of the two. Revenue is relatively trivial, and I say relatively somewhat facetiously, but it's relatively trivial in terms of approach, rather than enrollment, which tends to be a lot trickier to actually predict to a high level of accuracy. So because enrollment is usually the single biggest determining factor of determining revenues, this is the best place to kind of start our conversation. And so we're largely going to be looking at different enrollment forecasting models and methods first, and then we can look at the revenue side of things once we have some kind of enrollment projection method in place. So you may ask, what's the best way to predict enrollment? Yes, I asked ChatGPT this question, and not surprisingly, the answer is it depends. There is no one size fits all approach, and every institution is going to be different. Today, we're going to be covering both simple and advanced models. But what's interesting is that sometimes the simple model will actually be way more effective at predicting enrollment for your particular institution. So because there is no one size fits all approach, I would recommend going after several different methods. Some might be more advanced than others, and seeing which ones are most effective at determining future counts of students for your particular school. So by no means are we playing favorite here. Some of these very simple models are also extremely effective at predicting the future. And with that in mind, let's start with the simplest model that we'll cover for today's session, which is our baseline model. So I mentioned that historical data, looking at historical data, can be very essential in terms of trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. Of course, if we have access to accurate historical data, that is going to be a sample size that we can use to start to extrapolate and try to figure out what's going to happen in future semesters and future years. But this is a very simple model because you're looking at your historical counts of students across your different departments or programs or faculties. And then you're looking at the ratio of those students between the overall school population and those particular departments and programs. So if I'm going to use a very simple example, let's say that my school has 50% of students enrolled in English and 10% of students are enrolled in math. If we adjust the overall number of students at the institution, for example, maybe we're increasing the number of students at our school by 100. Well, based on this baseline approach, then we would expect an extra 50 students in English next year, and we expect another 10 students in math, accounting for that 100% increase to more or less follow the ratios between the different departments at the school. So it's extremely simple in its approach. And if you did want to actually build out this model as like a spreadsheet, for example, it would be extremely trivial, and you would most likely have the ability to do that in a couple of hours, assuming you had access to that historical data and information. So that's one of the big pros to this, is that you can have that kind of that number that's going to be predicted very easily. The downside, of course, is that institutional growth, or shrinkage, if we're going to be reducing our student population, is really only one factor that we're looking at. And this model is really only looking at that overall institutional population change as the driving factor for future enrollment, which of course, although it can play a very large part, it's by no means the only factor that we should be considering with a robust model. And so if the overall either growth or shrinkage of the student population isn't going to be the biggest determining factor, then you may have projection methods that are a bit off. because you're not accounting for other factors which could be incredibly important. For example, if we just hired a Nobel Prize winning math professor, I would maybe expect that 10% number to drastically increase, whether or not we grow the overall size of the institution at large. So that's our first model. That's the baseline approach. For the second model, we can also look at trend line analysis. Similar to, you may see stock market pictures that look similar to what we're looking at now. How can I predict if a stock is going to go up or down in price? Well, one way to do that is to employ regression analysis over several years of historical data to extrapolate trends. You know, what is going to happen based on the trend that's happening in a given department or program. As you can see, these trends can be downtrends. You know, a program may be becoming less and less popular. A program may be becoming more and more popular, like because of our Nobel-winning math professor. Or it could be completely flat. You know, we might have 10 students in math every year, no matter what happens for the last 10 years. Well, trend line would expect another 10 students in math next year. The other nice thing about this approach is that although it's a little bit more complicated than baseline, it's still relatively easy to create a spreadsheet with some simple formulas to take whatever that trend is and then take the number of students and apply that same probability to the future years. So it is relatively simple to calculate and get an idea of what these various trends are within the different departments and programs of the school. But one of the big weaknesses to trends is that we can have these big time wrenches that get thrown in, like, for example, a global pandemic that could restrict and throw all of these trends completely out of whack. Now, I will say that almost every model approach is going to be weak to some wrenches, like a global pandemic. However, better and more advanced models can also do a better job of being able to accommodate for things like edge cases, which might completely throw off the general trend that we see within a student population. Now, for this next example, this is more advanced. This is what we call a Markov chain. Some people also refer to this as Markov processes. And this is looking at largely current states and trying to predict the future state based on that those particular variables that make up the current state. This is actually extremely popular within a large amount of different disciplines. Markov chains are used successfully in information theory, to statistics, to biology even. And largely they do an excellent job of being able to predict the future state based on current state information. These largely disregard historical information as an approach. But the nice thing is that this is going to give us probabilities which will determine the likelihood of a future state existing. Now, this is an extremely simple example on the right-hand side of our slide here. We can see that there's only 3 states within this particular model. We have A, B, and C. And I'll try to use a real world example to make this a little bit easier to understand. Let's pretend that I'm running a restaurant and my restaurant only serves 3 things. One thing each day. We serve tacos, we serve burgers, and we serve pizza. And we'll say tacos are A, burgers are B, and pizza C for this example. Now, we're going to start at state A. The reason why we're starting at state A is that, not surprisingly, every Tuesday, like it is today, is Taco Tuesday. It's very popular. People love tacos, so we're going to always serve tacos on Tuesday, no matter what happens. However, there is going to be a 0% chance that we serve tacos on Wednesday. Reason being, we sell out every time. We're going to need at least one day to replenish, you know, the salsa and tortillas and anything else that I might be selling. So when we're moving from Tuesday to Wednesday, there are 2 probabilities. There's some probability that we're going to serve burgers, and there's some probability that we serve pizza. And by running a simulation, we can extract these probabilities, and we can reach these different statistical equilibriums such that in this example, we can see that there's a 60% chance that we serve pizza on Wednesday, and there's a 40% chance that I serve burgers. So over time, we're able to then predict what will happen on Thursday. we could go back to tacos, for example. There's some percentage that we go back to A. There's also a chance that either I serve burgers or pizza twice in a row, and you'll see that those loops that are going back to the same state means that that state repeats. So when we go from Tuesday to Wednesday, it's 60-40. However, if I go to C, for example, which is pizza, there's a 20% chance that we serve pizza twice in a row, and then we can repeat the entire exercise over and over ad infinitum. So what we're doing here is basically finding out the likelihood of going from one state to another, or if we're going to use the enrollment example, what's the likelihood of a student going from one semester to another, or to apply or be accepted at your school in the first place. These Markov chains can do an excellent job of using math to predict this future behavior. The downside, of course, is that these can be extremely complicated, and the calculations that are necessary to arrive at these equilibriums can be extremely taxing in terms of calculation power. This is a model that only has 3 potential states. Imagine a model that has, dozens of different states, and kind of some of the complexity that can come with figuring out what the likelihood is of going from one of those 50 states to another. And then the other big downside to Markov chains is that the effective outliers can be dampened overall. So when we have big, again, wrenches that might be thrown into trends, this can sometimes dampen those overall effects and reduce, the severity of planning around those outliers. Okay, so for our fourth approach, we're going to look at the cohort survival method. This is actually a method that's largely used in K-12 school boards to predict their enrollment numbers across, the school boards. But basically what this does is it looks at a likelihood of a given group of students, and then we're calculating the probability that they survive, to use air quotes, from one semester to the next, or from 1 year to the next if we're doing a more simplified cohort survival method. So essentially, if I'm a brand new student and I've enrolled in a given program, what's the likelihood that I make it past the initial fall semester to the spring? What's, again, the probability that I go from the spring to the summer, or to the summer to the following fall, and so on and so forth. If I roll in a particularly difficult program, my chance of dropping out might increase for each semester that I progress. But at some point, everyone's going to drop off. If we have a 4-year program, for example, I would expect a very large drop off of that cohort to happen in the 4th year. But I would also expect some students to drop out before that. Some may even continue to a 5th or a 6th year. But those would most likely be the edge cases and not the majority. So basically, you work out these different ratios. How likely am I to go from birth to freshman, or freshman to sophomore, and so on and so forth, or for undergraduate to graduate, and then we can work out what those numbers look like when we apply those different persistency ratios to all of the different types of students that are applying at my particular school. And one of the big strengths to this approach is that we can also factor in other key things that might affect the student population, like the birth rates, for example, in our jurisdiction. So if we have a majority of domestic students, I would want to look at what those domestic population birth rates are. If we see a massive increase in birth rates or decrease in birth rates, then we can expect that to have some long-term effects once those students are old enough to start enrolling in my school. And it can also be really helpful to be able to predict things like student transfers and mobility in general, because essentially, if a student transfers to another school, that's the same as them not surviving in this particular example. Fifth model we can look at is what we're going to call the University of Delaware model. This is that white paper that I was describing earlier. So we will be putting that in the chat if anyone would like to give it a quick read. It's not incredibly long, but it is very powerful. The backstory to this particular model is that the University of Delaware realized that they didn't have a very robust way to predict enrollment and therefore revenues. So they were looking at all of the literature similar to what we've done already today. What are the different approaches? What are people saying are the best techniques and methods to predict enrollment at the school? And they didn't find anything that really satisfied them. So they set out to make a model of their own. So basically what this does is it looks at 5 years of historical student information, and then it comes up with the specific yield and retention rates that would apply to your school based on all the different types of students and what these rates and counts look like when looking at a macro level, when looked at a macro level. So by yield rates, I mean, the opposite of acceptance rates, essentially. If I apply to your school, there's some probability that I get accepted to the school. So that would be the acceptance rate. Yield rate is how likely I am to actually go to your school if I am accepted. So how likely is the student to actually yield any revenue is going to be based on all those different kind of demographic factors that we talked about, or different programs or very institutionally dependent factors that might feed into that historical information. The writers of the paper as well recommended 5 years of historical data. However, you could use the same technique and go back further if there's value in doing so, or less far if perhaps the data isn't in as good a shape the further you go back. And then in the case of the University of Delaware, once they took this approach and applied it to their particular school, they found that with enrollment, they were within 1% of what actually happened at the university. So as a model, it was incredibly successful, but they continue to tinker with that approach today. And that general concept could be applied to any institution and hopefully have similar results, because within 1% degree of accuracy is incredibly impressive due to all those different factors we've covered so far. And then this is the first model that explicitly also links enrollment to budgeting. So then there is an entire component to the model that looks specifically at revenues. We'll be talking more generally about revenue forecasting a little bit later on. And by no means is today's session meant to be an exhaustive list. There are infinite ways that you could potentially or theoretically predict enrollment and tuition. So we want you to know that there's a lot of other potential models and approaches that are out there. There are always going to be more and more robust statistical approaches and analysis, which are going to give us more and more of an ability to predict into the future. So some of these are going to be maybe more effective than others, and technology might also enhance our ability to actually take some of these cutting edge approaches in the future when we're looking to get a good sense of exactly what to expect at the school. Now, other than very briefly with Delaware, we haven't talked much about revenues yet, but without trying to be pedantic, this is much more trivial than the enrollment forecasting side. The most difficult part of predicting revenue is predicting enrollment. Once you have that part sorted out, it really can be as easy as counts times rates. What are the counts of students that I have to accommodate, and what are the different rates of revenue or sources of revenue that would apply to each of those different counts? So really, it can be boiled down to that simple of an approach, but the complexity is in all of those different dimensions that need to be accounting for. And if there's any variability within those dimensions, because you may have situations where revenues might be calculated differently depending on student choice or student behaviors for which you can't necessarily predict. So all the different revenue streams have to be included in order for you to have an accurate prediction of revenue at the school. So, are there public funds? Are there are there grants and scholarship money that is coming in? Are there, research grants that are being funded by, private corporations or by, government institutions? And what are the different student fees that would apply to the different types of students we have at the school? All of these need to be accounted for to get a complete picture of revenue at the institution. And a really strong and robust model is going to be able to allow you to isolate any of these individual dimensions and then run scenarios. What if we were to change our tuition rates, for example? What if we were to increase our student fees? What if the number of students changes? A good model should be able to allow you to tweak any of these particular drivers and assumptions so that you can analyze what those potential impacts would be before they actually take place. Or if you're planning on making some, financial changes down the road, well, why don't you make those scenarios, run that analysis, and then see, exactly what makes sense at an institutional level. So this can really help inform senior leadership and decision-making at the institution by being able to play around with all these different factors. It's one thing to have a very accurate projection method in place, but you should also be able to say, well, what if something changes? What if we open a new campus? What if we open this new program? Those are the types of things you should be able to play around with to see what those potential impacts would be without actually affecting anything that might necessarily happen in real life. Now, regardless of the approach you take as an institution, at some point you're going to need to convert one of these theories or one of these approaches or methods to practice. What are you actually going to do at the school in order to start taking advantage of some of these different approaches? Do you have a dedicated institutional wing that's already aimed at doing exactly this type of work? Would this be something that finance is going to be taking on because we are talking about revenue forecasting? Regardless of the approach, you will first need buy-in from the relevant stakeholders in order for anything to be successful. So it goes without saying, but especially senior leadership and the key stakeholders that are going to be involved in the different areas of the school engaged in these exercises is going to be essential to the long-term success at the institutional level of whatever that approach ends up being. So we need buy-in from the key people. We also need to keep that buy-in over time by keeping people updated and appraised on how exactly we're doing. If we were testing out several models, which one ended up being the most effective? Do we have an objective way to actually tell that? And do we have a way to actually judge each model's success against itself? All of these are going to be important, but we need buy-in from the right people at the school to actually do anything with the information that we're going to be generating at the end of the day. And then, of course, when we start applying one of these models to practice, it could be as simple as creating an Excel spreadsheet. I could have a baseline Excel spreadsheet. I could have a trend line Excel spreadsheet, with the various formulas and calculations that these approaches require in order to spit out and start forecasting some of these future student counts and revenue sources. And Excel is extremely robust. It's a very, very powerful tool to be able to perform complex calculations and apply formulas, but it doesn't come without its drawbacks either. We can have things like version control and human error, and also just the opaqueness of having a very advanced spreadsheet can be very difficult, especially for things like continuity. The classic, what happens if my Excel guru doesn't come to work tomorrow? Do you have a plan in place? Does anyone really understand what's happening? Especially the more complex the spreadsheet can be very difficult. And then in terms of a homebrew approach, some institutions do have higher level research being done at the student level. Sometimes if you have the funding and the bandwidth and the capacity, as an institution, you can set out to create your own solutions specifically aimed at making one of these projection methods for you. So certainly that's a valid approach, but resource constraints can really make that difficult. And anytime you have a homebrew solution, of course, you would need things in place to manage and maintain those solutions over time. If you had a group of PhD students that built you something really slick, that's great, but what happens when they leave the school, 10 years from now? Is there some kind of succession plan in place for when that day comes? And then the final option would be to go and get an actual platform, some kind of a software solution that's aimed at performing exactly this type of analysis and allow you to forecast your various expenses and revenues based on one or several of these models at the same time, as well as run scenarios to plan for the what if, which may happen as an institution. Of course, that's a valid approach as well, but platforms are not going to come without their own costs, and not every solution is going to be made equally. Some vendors are probably going to provide better solutions and better service than others. So the institution has to judge which one is going to be most effective for their own situation. And if we're going to take that last point a little bit further, the benefits that platforms can provide would allow for things like secure and seamless transition and automation. of these different stakeholders. So good platforms will be able to notify your stakeholders when their inputs are required, and also keep them up to date with what's actually being projected and forecasted, which will affect their areas of the institution. And ideally, a good platform is going to allow you to have multiple models and multiple scenarios at play so that you can do any kind of discriminant analysis to say, hey, if we were to change this one assumption, what would the actual impacts be overall to the bottom line of the institution? And just like Excel, good platforms should also be able to automate the calculations and formulas that are necessary to carry out, especially some of the more advanced types of calculations that we saw in the models today. If I had a very, very robust Markov chain, I would probably need an entirely chaotic looking group of Excel formulas to arrive at those endpoints, especially when we're doing a more advanced model that has to account for potentially, tens of thousands of permutations. So a good platform should be able to do everything that Excel provides, but offer a little bit more security and things like version control that can be struggles within a spreadsheet. And that final point can't really be overstated. By being able to centralize all of your assumptions in a model, you can also extrapolate from those and change any of those particular drivers. Scenarios are going to be essential to the long-term health of an organization, and also allow you to pivot very quickly when one of those fun wrenches we talked about earlier gets thrown at an institution, whether it's a finance department or an institutional planning department. Being able to quickly spin up, hey, this changed, we need to go and make a plan for this new reality. You should have a platform that allows you to do that type of thing very easily. And then in terms of future technology considerations, ChatGPT can't solve this problem today. Who knows in the future what that will look like? Everyone knows that we're making leaps and bounds progress within machine learning and artificial intelligence, but we're still at, very much the infancy stage in these different areas. Computers are already better than humans at things like, chess and, gambling and some other predictive type of exercises, but there's still luckily a spot for us humans. Currently, who knows what that looks like in the future. And as processing power increases, some of the limitations that you can run into in terms of complexity should be accommodated by increases in processing power and just the ability to take on some of these very robust calculations and models as templates. So who really knows what the future looks like? But of course, technology may make other approaches more attractive than others from the ones we saw today. And finally, when we're looking at what's next, of course, enrollment and revenue is really only one part of the overall financial picture of an institution. We need to look at all, the complete expenses and revenue situation to determine the overall health of an institution. So are there other sources of revenue that schools can explore? Of course, tuition rates are, fairly hot button topic in terms of how much they've increased over the years. So more and more institutions are looking at alternative forms of revenue that may not ask as much from just the enrollment side to work as an organization. Are there things like co-op programs that, for example, could be explored to be an alternative source of revenue than the traditional tuition rates? And then can we incorporate other performance data into the overall picture of the school and the planning exercises? Every institution is going to have things like strategic plans and goals, but are you measuring the key performance indicators that are measured to track the long-term success of those goals and of those plans? So that incorporation of that type of performance data is going to lead to more overall, a more robust picture of what's going on in the school overall. If you, for example, have a goal to increase graduation rates, well, your models, your planning exercise should include incorporating that graduation rate data in the overall picture. So yes, enrollment might be going up, but is the graduation rate going down? That could reveal some underlying systemic problems at the school that need to be addressed, rather than just focusing in on the enrollment and the potential revenue we'd get from that enrollment overall. And really, we're not looking at the expenses side of things, but you do need to also account for, how much all of this costs. It's great to have a clear picture of what's going to happen in terms of revenues, but ultimately we also have things like administrative costs. We have, just physical costs as well related to putting on these different programs and hiring the key people that are delivering the education. So we also need to also match up what these models are telling us with the actual reality of the expenses needed to actually perform these operations over time. And ultimately, succession planning should be part of all of this. If you are a school where one or two people are responsible for 90% of the financial planning, well, what happens when those people retire? What happens when those people move to another school? Is there some kind of succession plan in place? Are there new people being trained on how to carry that institutional knowledge forward to whoever comes next? That should absolutely be part of this entire discussion so that you can avoid those situations where the key person's retiring at the end of the year and everyone else is scrambling to figure out what they've been doing for the last 20 years. Okay, so that is the main thrust of what I wanted. I see quite a few questions popping in and things in the chat. So now's the perfect time to start addressing some of those. If anyone does have to go, we are recording this part of the session as well. So feel free to drop off and I'm happy to give everyone a couple of minutes back in their day. Serena, did you want to call out some of these questions or did you want me to just read them out?
Yeah, you can go ahead and read out. I think we did address some of the questions related to the University of Delaware budget model. So I shared that link in the chat. And then for the first Q&A, how might AI and ML be incorporated into forecasting and modeling? I know you did touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, great question. And really it does depend, but as these systems become more sophisticated, and as our sample sizes for these different models also is going to increase over time, one would expect that artificial intelligence and machine learning would also be able to use these various approaches to start giving you different forecasts and examples. And there's a reason why almost every tech company that's out there during their earnings calls is at least paying lip service to the idea of machine learning and artificial intelligence, because frankly, it's extremely exciting. I can't answer that today, of course, but the sky's the limit. In theory, the greater the AI models and machine learning approaches, the better the outputs are going to be, not just, of course, for projections, but also just for everything, really. So super exciting to see where that goes in the future, but good question.
Great. We have another question. Would you please repeat your example of other revenues? That may have been a specific part in the presentation.
Other revenues. I mean, really, I'm saying other revenues as any revenue that's distinct from like tuition rates and student fees. So it really can be dependent on anything. There could be private investment in research activities. It could be various scholarships that nonprofits are providing, or even government entities are providing. There can be things like state funding formulas or county funding formulas. That could be a source of important revenue for institutions. So really, I'm just trying to distinguish from specifically the revenues that you're collecting from your student population. So other revenues would be anything other than that in that example.
Perfect. The next question here is, which model do nonprofit schools tend to lean toward?
Good question. I mean, when we remove the profit motive, that does make some of the planning exercise, sometimes a little bit easier. Sometimes it presents its own challenges, but there is no one size fits all for approaches. As I mentioned, many schools will actually have like an institutional planning department that specifically is aimed at projecting revenues, but the methods that they use to do that is going to vary from one institution to the next. Nonprofit is certainly one certain very important thing to consider when making these plans, but it doesn't necessarily lead to one approach versus another.
Perfect. The next question we have here, can you speak to the incorporation of financial aid planning in predicting enrollment and tuition revenues?
Yes, very good question. So anytime we have these, subsidies, we have scholarships, we have different types of financial aid that could apply to certain students. We're going to need to factor that in because that could potentially reduce the overall amount of revenues that the school is providing if the school is covering, parts of a tuition or parts of, the cost that normally would apply to a student. So that needs to be like a negative revenue source that we're adding into the model, so that we're accounting for the net profit overall, but we also want to be able to see within the model how much is financial aid a factor in these future revenue projections. Do certain students apply for financial aid more than others? Well, if that's the case, then we're going to expect to project more financial aid as the number of those affected students increases over time.
Perfect. The next question we have here, are there any Excel templates that can be used to start a model?
Honestly, yes, there is. If you Google this for a lot, you could find, at least starting points for a lot of this, but sometimes some of these models, it's really as simple as starting a blank spreadsheet and then start to incorporate the rows and columns which distinguish your historical student data. Once you have that baseline of information, we can start to play around with some of these different approaches. If I'm going to be doing my trend line analysis, well, I'll take the last 3 years of student data in this program, and then I could have Excel determine what that percentage change for each year is and extrapolate it into the future years. So enrollment went up by 20% each year. I write a formula and now I just take whatever last year's value is and add 20%. So
Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question off of that same topic, for the baseline and trend line models, do you also recommend 5 years of historical data?
Well, from my perspective, the more the better. If you have more of a sample size, you're going to be able to more accurately account for exceptions to the rule, and you can also have that bigger sample size to work on. But it's going to depend on how healthy the data is as well. A lot of institutions struggle because they may have changed ERPs or student information systems at a particular point in time. And if you go back further than that, then the information's in a completely different format. And you're going to have to spend a ton of calories to match up apples to apples. So although 5+ years would be great, it's not always viable for the institution. I would look at the hygiene of your data, because regardless of what approach you have, if the model's based on insufficient or incomplete data, then you're going to get varying results.
Great. We had another question that came up in the chat. Can you please recommend models or tools for expense projections?
Sure. So any like sophisticated like budgeting or financial planning software should give you options in terms of how you project your expenses at the school. That's going to be unique to your institution, but things like personnel costs, for example, can quite often be tied to like collectively bargained agreements with things like bargaining units and unions. So sophisticated tools should be able to keep those agreements in the background so that you have a way to forecast when a professor is eligible for their next bonus or step increase or merit increase, and things like that. And then for non-personnel expenses, it can vary. Sometimes it's as simple as adjusting for inflation each year for the cost of supplies and materials. But other types of expenses may be based on different variables that you need to account for. So the answer is it depends, but sophisticated solutions should be able to do both forecasting of expenses and revenues to a very specific degree.
Got it. Okay. I think we have time for just a couple other questions. So one we have here, a little bit of a comment as well. It seems that much of the modeling needs to be time bound in that earlier causes influence sequential outcomes that follow. What is better or a better way to model time bound elements? Separate models that feed into the next model, or models that run simultaneously and include time as an element?
Yeah, heavy question there. There's a lot of profane answers I think I could say to that, but it is necessary to have an element of time in any of these models because at the end of the day, we do need to predict revenue in specific time periods. But I will say that the granularity within each model and approach can also depend on time. So that in some models cases, like in our University of Delaware white paper, they break it up based on semesters so that there's 3 distinct semesters each year that the model's projecting revenues for. So that in my summer semester, I would expect probably less revenue overall than my fall and spring semesters. In most cases, I would say, but there might be programs that are exceptions to that rule. But time is necessary as a factor on some degree. So decoupling time constraints from the model can be effective, I guess, in some thought experiments, but ultimately, whether it's by semester, by month, or by year, you're going to need to have a concept of how many students are in that time period and calculate the revenues to collect from those different types of students.
Great, thanks for that answer. I believe we have one or time for one last question. One of the biggest recent challenges for building a stable projection has been the impact of the pandemic, which disrupted longitudinal and trend data. Can you suggest a workaround? Treat it as an outlier, apply a factor based on agreed upon assumptions or other recommendations?
Yeah, good question. That's why I think today's session was looking at potential different ways to solve this problem because it's certainly the case that in terms of wrenches being thrown, I can't think of a bigger one for higher education than the global pandemic on just student behaviors and enrollment trends that have happened as a result. So any model should have some ability to apply a fudge factor to the data. So if your model is not giving you accurate counts based on these different trend changes, then you either need to look at a different model or approach, or need to put in some kind of a fudge factor to perhaps address this kind of temporary, hopefully temporary, change in behavior as a result of the pandemic. As it might turn out, though, these might not be temporary changes. So any model should look at those historical trends and start to extrapolate and say what that means for the future. And not all of them are based on historical data as well. So maybe using more of a present day forward analysis is going to be more effective if indeed those long-term repercussions of the pandemic are going to extend indefinitely.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob, for those answers. And thanks everyone for joining. I guess I can pass it back over to Janelle to close things off.
Yes, we'll go ahead and end the event. Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for attending. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time today.